Jake Morrison sat in the pilot seat of his small ship as it moved through the dark space near the Kepler system, and he checked his instruments one more time before sending his daily report back to Earth Command, and the mission was simple enough. Just fly around this area for a few weeks and watch for any signs of alien activity while staying hidden from enemy sensors, and Jake had done this kind of work many times before, so he felt calm and ready for whatever might happen next, and the stars looked peaceful through his front window as he made notes about the empty space around him and sent another data packet home to his commanders, who were waiting for any news about alien movements in this sector, and Jake had been out here for 12 days already with nothing interesting to report until today when his long-range sensors started picking up something strange moving toward him from behind a large asteroid, and he turned his ship to get a better look at whatever was coming his way, and the readings on his screen made him frown because the energy signature was definitely not human technology, and it was moving too fast to be a normal cargo ship or mining vessel, and Jake felt his heart beat faster as he realized he might have found exactly what Earth Command had sent him here to look for, and he quickly started recording everything his sensors could detect about the unknown craft that was now clearly heading straight toward his position, and he tried to send an emergency message back to Earth, but his communications were suddenly cut off by some kind of jamming signal that filled all the radio frequencies with static noise, and Jake knew he was in serious trouble now because his small scout ship had no weapons and very little armor compared to whatever was approaching him through the darkness of space, and the alien craft was getting closer every second, and he could see it clearly now through his front window, and it looked like nothing humans had ever built before, with strange curves and angles that hurt his eyes to look at directly, and the ship was at least 10 times bigger than his own vessel and covered with what looked like weapons that were already turning to point at him, and Jake tried to run, but his engine suddenly stopped working as some kind of invisible beam hit his ship and drained all the power from his systems and left him floating helpless in space while the alien vessel moved alongside him like a giant predator circling its prey, and Jake watched through his window as a bright light appeared on the side of the alien ship and began pulling his vessel toward what looked like a docking bay, and he tried everything he could think of to restart his engines, but nothing worked, and his ship was being drawn inside the alien craft whether he wanted to go or not, and Jake took a deep breath and prepared himself for whatever was about to happen because he had trained for situations like this. Even though he had hoped he would never actually face capture by hostile aliens, and the last thing he saw before his ship was pulled completely inside the enemy vessel was the vast darkness of space where no one from Earth would ever think to look for him, and then heavy metal doors closed behind him with a sound like thunder, and Jake found himself trapped inside the belly of an alien warship with nowhere to run and no way to call for help, and the air in his ship started to feel thin as alien gases began seeping in through the ventilation system, and Jake put on his emergency mask just before he passed out from breathing the strange atmosphere, and when he woke up later, he was lying on a cold metal floor in a room filled with bright lights, and standing over him were 3 tall creatures that looked almost like humans except for their gray skin and large black eyes that seemed to look right through him, and one of them spoke to him in perfect English, which surprised Jake because he had not expected aliens to know his language so well, and the creature said, "Welcome aboard our ship, human, and we know exactly who you are and what you were doing in our territory." And Jake tried to stand up but found that his arms and legs would not move properly because of some kind of drug they had given him while he was unconscious, and the alien continued speaking and said, "You are Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison of the Earth Defense Force, and you carry valuable information about your species' military capabilities and defensive positions, and we intend to extract that information from you using methods that have never failed us before." And Jake tried to speak, but his voice came out as just a whisper, and he asked them, what they wanted from him, and the lead alien smiled with too many teeth and said, "We want everything you know about Earth and its defenses, and you will tell us everything before we are finished with you, because no creature in the galaxy has ever been able to resist our interrogation techniques for more than a few days." And Jake felt fear creeping up his spine, but he also felt something else rising in his chest, and it was the same stubborn anger that had gotten him through military training and helped him survive dangerous missions before. And he looked the alien right in those large black eyes and said, "You can try to break me, but I am human, and we do not break easily." And the alien laughed and said, "We shall see about that, human." And then Jake was dragged away to a small cell where his real ordeal was about to begin. The cell where they put Jake was barely big enough for him to lie down, and the walls were made of some kind of smooth metal that felt cold against his skin, and there were no windows or decorations of any kind, just 4 blank walls and a ceiling that glowed with harsh white light that never dimmed or changed. And Jake sat on the hard floor and tried to think about what he knew about alien interrogation methods from his training classes back on Earth, and most of what he remembered was not encouraging, because the instructors had told them that aliens were much better at psychological warfare than humans and could break down a person's mind in ways that physical torture never could. And Jake wondered how long he would be able to hold out against whatever they were planning to do to him. And he did not have to wait very long to find out, because after what felt like only a few hours, the cell door opened and 2 guards came in to drag him down a long corridor filled with strange sounds and smells, and they brought him to a room that looked like a medical laboratory, except all the equipment was designed for causing pain instead of healing and standing. In the center of the room was the alien who had spoken to him before, and this creature introduced himself as Subcommander Vexthol and said he was an expert at extracting information from unwilling prisoners and had never failed to break a captive, no matter what species they belonged to. And Jake was strapped down to a metal table that adjusted itself to hold his body in the most uncomfortable position possible, and Vexthol began the interrogation by asking simple questions about Earth's defenses, and when Jake refused to answer, the alien activated a device that sent waves of pain through his nervous system, and the pain was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced before, because it seemed to come from inside his own body and made every muscle feel like it was being torn apart. And Vexthol asked the questions again, and when Jake still refused to answer, the pain got worse and lasted longer, and the alien explained that this was just the beginning and that he had many other methods available if the simple pain was not effective enough. And then the interrogation room went completely dark, and Jake could not see his own hands in front of his face, and the silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears, and this continued for what felt like hours, until Jake began to wonder if he had gone blind and deaf. And then suddenly the lights came back on brighter than before, and loud sounds filled the room from all directions, and the noise was so intense that Jake thought his eardrums might burst. And Vexthol was saying something, but Jake could not hear the words over the terrible sound. And then everything went quiet again, and the alien asked his questions once more, and Jake gritted his teeth and refused to speak, and Vexthol seemed surprised that the human was still resisting after the sensory torture, and decided to try a different approach, and he activated a holographic projector that filled the Chilaviville room with images of Earth being destroyed by alien weapons and fake news reports claiming that Jake's family and friends were already dead, and the images looked so real that Jake felt sick watching them, but he reminded himself that these were just tricks designed to break his spirit, and he closed his eyes and tried not to look at the horrible scenes playing out around him. And Vexthol grew frustrated and increased the intensity of his methods and began cycling Jake through extreme heat and cold that made him sweat and shiver at the same time, and the alien kept asking the same questions over and over while subjecting Jake to different combinations of pain and fear and sensory overload. And Jake found that each new torture was easier to handle than the last because he was learning to separate his mind from what was happening to his body, and he began to think about his training and how his instructors had taught him to find an inner place of calm even during the worst situations, and he remembered stories his grandfather had told him about surviving as a prisoner of war, and how the old man had said that the enemy could hurt your body, but they could only reach your mind if you let them. Jake started to focus on those lessons instead of the pain, and he began to notice things about his interrogator that Vexthul probably did not want him to see, and the alien was getting nervous when his standard methods failed to work, and Jake could tell that Vexthul was under pressure from his superiors to get results quickly, and this gave Jake hope because it meant the aliens were not as confident as they pretended to be, and after several more hours of failed torture, Vexthul left the room, and Jake heard him talking to someone in the corridor, and the conversation sounded angry, even though Jake could not understand the alien language, and when Vexthul returned, he brought new equipment and said that Jake had forced him to use more advanced methods, and the new device looked like a helmet covered with wires and small machines, and when they put it on Jake's head, he felt something trying to push into his thoughts and read his memories, but Jake had been trained to resist mental intrusion, and he built walls in his mind and filled his thoughts with nonsense and random images, and after a while the alien removed the helmet and looked confused because the device had not worked the way it was supposed to. And Jake smiled despite the pain he was feeling and said, "Is that the best you can do?" And Vexthul's large black eyes showed something that might have been worry. By the end of the first week, Jake had survived every torture method that Vexthul could think of, and something strange was happening to him because instead of getting weaker, he felt like he was getting stronger, and each time the alien tried a new way to break his spirit, Jake found it easier to resist, and he began to understand that pain was just information and fear was just a feeling, and neither one had any real power over him unless he gave them that power. And this realization made him almost laugh out loud during one particularly brutal session where Vexthul was using sonic waves to make Jake's bones vibrate, and the alien stopped the torture and asked why the human was making that sound, and Jake explained that he was laughing because he had just figured out something important, and Vexthul demanded to know what could possibly be funny about being tortured, and Jake said that the alien had helped him discover that he was much stronger than he had ever imagined. And this seemed to disturb Vexthul more than anything else that had happened so far, and the interrogator began to look worried and started asking other aliens for advice about how to handle a prisoner who seemed to be enjoying the torture sessions. And Jake was not really enjoying the pain, but he had learned to find something valuable in every moment of suffering, and he started to think about all the humans throughout history who had endured terrible hardships and come out stronger on the other side, and he thought about soldiers who had marched through winter storms, and explorers who had crossed impossible oceans, and ordinary people who had survived wars and plagues and natural disasters, and he realized that every human alive today was descended from people who had refused to give up no matter how bad things got, and this knowledge filled him with pride and determination, and he began to talk during the torture sessions instead of just gritting his teeth and staying silent, and he told Vexthul stories about human achievements and explained how his species had learned to turn adversity into strength, and the alien listened with growing confusion because this was not how prisoners were supposed to behave, and Jake described how humans had survived ice ages and asteroid impacts and countless other disasters that should have destroyed them completely. And each time they had come back stronger and more determined than before, and Vexthul tried to interrupt these stories by increasing the pain, but Jake just kept talking, and his voice got stronger instead of weaker, and he began to recite poetry that he had learned in school and sing songs that soldiers had sung during long marches and tell jokes that people had shared during the worst moments of their lives, and the alien interrogator had never encountered anything like this before because most prisoners either screamed or begged or went silent, but Jake was doing something completely different, and it was making Vextil nervous and uncomfortable, and after 2 weeks of failed torture sessions, the alien began to report to his superiors that the human prisoner was not responding to standard interrogation methods and might require special handling, and Jake could hear these conversations through the thin walls of his cell, and he learned that the aliens were starting to argue among themselves about what to do with him, and some of them wanted to try even more extreme methods, while others thought it might be better to just execute him and be done with it. And Jake realized that he was winning this psychological war even though he was still trapped and helpless, and this gave him even more confidence, and he started to study his captors during the torture sessions and began to understand their behavior, patterns, and motivations, and he noticed that Vextil was afraid of failing in front of his colleagues and that the guards were uncomfortable being around prisoner who did not act like a victim, and Jake began to use this knowledge against them by making observations about their personalities and pointing out their weaknesses and insecurities. And during one session, he told Vextil that the interrogator was obviously under pressure from his commanders and was probably worried about his career, and the alien's large black eyes widened in surprise because Jake had guessed correctly about something he should not have been able to know, and Jake continued to analyze his captors and predict their behavior, and he was right so often that the aliens began to think he might have supernatural powers or access to information that should have been impossible for him to obtain, and the guards started to act nervous around him, and some of them avoided looking directly at him when they brought him food or took him to and from the interrogation room, and Jake realized that he had somehow become the one doing the psychological warfare instead of being the victim of it, and this reversal of roles was something that Vextil had never experienced before, and the alien interrogator began to show signs of stress and anxiety that Jake could easily recognize and exploit, and Jake started to feel sorry for his captors because they clearly had no idea how to handle a human who refused to be broken and instead kept getting stronger and more confident with each passing day, and he wondered how long it would be before they gave up completely. After 3 weeks of interrogation, the entire atmosphere on the alien ship had changed, and Jake could feel the difference even from inside his cell because the guards moved differently now, and their voices sounded worried when they talked to each other in the corridors, and Jake had become something they did not understand and could not control, and this was terrifying too. Creatures who had built their reputation on being able to break any prisoner within days, and Vextil had started to look sick and tired, and his hands trembled sometimes when he activated the torture devices, and Jake could see that the alien was beginning to doubt himself and his abilities, and this doubt was spreading to the other crew members who had heard stories about the human prisoner who could not be broken, and some of them had started to whisper that Jake possessed dark magic or was in contact with evil spirits, and these superstitions grew stronger every day as more aliens heard about the interrogation sessions where the prisoner laughed at pain and told stories instead of screaming, and Jake began to use these fears against his captors by making accurate predictions about their behavior and relationships. And during one session, he told Vextil that there would be a challenge to the ship commander's authority within the next few days, and he described exactly how it would happen and who would be involved, and Vextil dismissed this as impossible because Jake had no way of knowing about the ship's internal politics. But less than 2 days later, everything happened exactly as Jake had predicted, and a junior officer named Rexthal attempted to convince other crew members that their commander was not fit to lead them, and when this news reached Vextil, the interrogator stared at Jake with something that looked like terror and asked how the human could have known about something that had not even happened yet, and Jake smiled and said that humans were very good at understanding the psychology of other creatures and could predict behavior patterns once they learned enough about their subjects, and this explanation made Vexthul even more uncomfortable because it suggested that Jake had been studying all of them like laboratory specimens and had figured out their personalities and motivations and weaknesses, and Jake continued to demonstrate his understanding of alien psychology by commenting on the relationships between different crew members and predicting their reactions to various situations, and he was right. So often that even the guards began to look at him with superstitious dread, and some of them started to refuse duty assignments that would bring them too close to his cell, and the ship's medical officer reported that several crew members were having nightmares about the human prisoner and were requesting treatment for anxiety and sleep disorders, and the ship's commander Kethfair finally decided that he needed to see this strange prisoner for himself and understand why his crew was becoming so disturbed by a single captive human, and when Kethfair entered the interrogation room, Jake could immediately see that this alien was different from the others because he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never failed at anything important, and his large black eyes showed intelligence and curiosity instead of fear, and Jake knew that this would be his most dangerous opponent. Yet because Kethfair was not as easy to manipulate as Vexthul had been, and the commander began the conversation by asking Jake how he had managed to resist interrogation for so long, and Jake decided to be honest and explained that humans had evolved on a world where survival required constant struggle against hostile environments and dangerous predators and natural disasters, and this had shaped their psychology in ways that other species might not understand. And Kethfair listened carefully and asked questions about human history and culture, and Jake told him about wars and famines and plagues that had killed millions of people but had never destroyed the human spirit, and he explained how his species had learned to find meaning in suffering and turn trauma into strength, and Kethfair seemed genuinely interested in these concepts and asked Jake to give specific examples, and Jake described how human soldiers had endured years of brutal warfare and came home to build better societies, and how survivors of disasters had used their experiences to help others face similar challenges, and how people who had lost everything had somehow found the strength to start over and create new lives. And Kethfair admitted that his species had never developed this kind of psychological resilience because they had evolved on a world where survival depended on avoiding conflict rather than enduring it. And Jake realized that this conversation was more dangerous than any torture session because Kethfair was actually beginning to understand what made humans different, and this knowledge could be used against Earth in ways that simple military intelligence never could, and Jake decided that he needed to turn this educational exchange into another psychological victory, and he began to explain that the aliens had made a fundamental mistake by trying to break him because torture and suffering were things that humans used to make themselves stronger. And every day of pain had been like a training session that prepared him for even worse challenges, and Kethfair's expression changed as he began to understand that his crew had not been interrogating a prisoner, but had instead been helping to forge a weapon that could be used against them. The conversation between Jake and Kethfair continued for many hours and became a battle of minds that was more intense than any physical torture could have been, and the alien commander tried every psychological technique he knew to break down Jake's mental defenses, but Jake had been strengthened by weeks of failed interrogation, and his mind had become like armor that could not be penetrated by alien methods, and instead of defending himself, Jake went on the attack and began to analyze Kethfair's personality and leadership style, and he pointed out that the commander was under pressure from his own superiors to extract information from the human prisoner, and that his reputation as an invincible interrogator was being damaged by his failure to break. Jake and Kethfair tried to deny this, but Jake could see the truth in the alien's large black eyes, and he continued his psychological assault by describing how the crew was losing confidence in their commander and how other Officers were probably already planning to challenge Kethver's authority and take over the ship, and the alien commander became angry and activated pain devices to try to stop Jake from talking, but Jake just smiled and said that causing him pain would not change the facts about what was happening on the ship, and he continued to speak even while the torture machines sent waves of agony through his body, and his voice remained steady and confident as he explained that Kethver had already lost this battle the moment he decided to try to break a human being, because humans could not be broken the way other creatures could, and they became stronger when they were hurt instead of weaker, and Jake told the alien commander that he should study human history if he wanted to understand what his species was really capable of, and he described how humans had survived the destruction of entire civilizations and had built new ones from the ashes, and how they had endured slavery and oppression and genocide and had always found ways to fight back and win their freedom. And Kethver listened with growing horror as Jake explained that every human child learned stories about heroes who had overcome impossible odds and villains who had tried to break the human spirit and failed, and these stories were not just entertainment, but were actually training that prepared humans to face real adversity in their own lives. And Jake could see that the alien commander was beginning to understand that his species had made a terrible mistake by choosing humans as enemies, because they had picked a fight with creatures who were literally born to survive and overcome and thrive in the face of suffering. And Kethver finally stopped the torture devices and asked Jake what he wanted, and Jake said that he wanted the alien to understand that this interrogation had been a waste of time from the beginning, because no amount of pain or fear or psychological manipulation could make a human betray his own kind, and he explained that humans had something that the aliens clearly lacked, which was the ability to find purpose and meaning in their suffering, and this allowed them to endure anything and come out stronger on the other side. And Kethver asked if this meant that all humans were as resistant to interrogation as Jake was, and Jake smiled and said that he was actually just an ordinary human, and that there were billions of others like him on Earth who would be even harder to break because they had survived worse things than anything the aliens could imagine. And he told Kethver about human soldiers who had endured years of imprisonment and torture during wars and had never revealed military secrets, and said they'd endured years of imprisonment and torture during wars and had never revealed military secrets, and have they revealed military secrets, and said about ordinary people who had survived concentration camps and natural disasters and personal tragedies that would have destroyed most other creatures, and had somehow found the strength to rebuild their lives and help others do the same. And Jake explained that this kind of resilience was not rare among humans, but was actually the normal way that his species responded to hardship. And Kethver began to look sick as he realized that his entire species had fundamentally misunderstood what humans were capable of, and that every human they captured would be just as impossible to break as Jake had been. And the alien commander finally admitted that the interrogation had failed and that Jake would never give them the information they wanted. And Jake thanked him for the confession and said that the past month had been very educational for him, because he had learned things about his own strength and endurance that he never would have discovered without the aliens' help. And he told Kethver that he was actually grateful for the experience because it had made him a better soldier and a stronger person. And this final statement seemed to break something inside the alien commander, who realized that he had not only failed to extract information from his prisoner, but had actually made the human more dangerous than he had been before. The rescue came exactly 5 weeks after Jake had been captured, and it happened so suddenly that even he was surprised when the walls of his cell started shaking and alarm sounds filled the alien ship, and he could hear weapons fire and explosions echoing through the corridors, and then human voices shouting orders in English. And Jake felt relief and pride wash over him as he realized that Earth had not given up on him and had sent a rescue mission to bring him home, and the cell door was blasted open by Captain Lisa Henderson and Major Ryan Torres, who were leading a team of Earth Defense Force Marines, and they expected to find a broken and traumatized prisoner, but instead they discovered Jake sitting calmly on the floor with a slight smile on his face, and he stood up and saluted his rescuers and said it was good to see them. And Captain Henderson stared at him in amazement and asked if he was injured or needed medical attention, and Jake said he was fine and actually felt better than he had in years, and the rescue team looked confused because they had come prepared to carry out a man who might be barely alive after weeks of alien torture, but Jake walked out of his cell under his own power and seemed completely unaffected by his ordeal. And as they made their way through the ship corridors, Jake noticed that the alien crew members were avoiding eye contact with him, and some of them actually stepped back when he passed by. And Major Torres asked what had happened during the interrogation, and Jake said it was a long story, but the important thing was that the aliens had learned something very important about humans, and it was a lesson they would never forget. And when they reached the ship's bridge, Captain Henderson was surprised to find Kethfor waiting for them, and the alien commander immediately offered to surrender his entire crew without a fight, and he told the human officers that he no longer wished to be involved in any conflict with Earth. And Henderson was suspicious and asked why the aliens were giving up so easily, and Kethfor looked at Jake and said that his species had made a grave error in judgment about human capabilities, and they now understood that humans were far more dangerous than they had previously believed. And Jake stepped forward and said that he wanted to speak with Kethfor privately for a moment, and the alien commander agreed, and Jake told him that humans did not enjoy causing suffering, but they would defend themselves and their families with everything they had. And he explained that the best thing Kethfor could do for his own people was to spread the word that humans should be left alone and treated with respect, and the alien commander nodded and said he would make sure that other ships knew about what had happened here. And Jake said that was all he could ask for, and then the rescue team escorted him back to their ship, where the medical officer examined him and found that despite weeks of torture, Jake was in remarkably good physical and mental condition, and the doctor could not understand how anyone could survive that kind of treatment without showing signs of trauma or breakdown. And Jake tried to explain that the experience had actually made him stronger, but the medical staff did not believe him until they ran psychological tests and discovered that he was telling the truth. And during the trip back to Earth, Jake was debriefed by intelligence officers who wanted to know everything about alien interrogation methods and technology, but Jake was more interested in talking about what he had learned about human nature and resilience during his captivity, and he told them that every human had the potential to be unbreakable if they understood their own history and heritage and connected with the strength that had carried their ancestors through countless generations of hardship and survival. And when they finally reached Earth, Jake was promoted and given a medal for his service, but he was more proud of the fact that his story had spread throughout the human fleet and had become an inspiration to other soldiers who might face capture and interrogation in the future. And Jake requested assignment as an instructor at the military academy, where he could teach other humans about psychological resistance and mental toughness, and his classes became some of the most popular at the school, because students wanted to learn how to develop the same kind of unbreakable spirit that had allowed him to not only survive alien torture, but to turn it into a source of strength and confidence. And years later, when historians wrote about the first contact wars, they would mark Jake's capture and interrogation as the moment when both humans and aliens truly understood what humanity was capable of. And the phrase "you tried to break a human" became a rallying cry that reminded everyone that the human spirit could not be defeated by any enemy, no matter how powerful or advanced they might be. And Jake lived the rest of his life knowing that he had proven something important about his species, and that his suffering had not been meaningless, but had instead become a demonstration of human strength that would inspire generations of people who came after him.